Both universities have a poor record, and the same goes for track and field. Incidentally, the sports teams here at Maslow are always looking for new members, in particular those with a strong background in sport. Now, let's move on to the facilities in the Student Union.
That is the end of Section 2. You now have half a minute to check your answers. Listening Section 3. In a moment, you are going to hear a conversation between Teresa and Bob, two economics students. They are having a cup of coffee between lectures. Before you listen, look at questions 22 to 33. Note the examples that have been done for you. As you listen to the conversation, answer questions 22 to 33.
This is yummy coffee, Bob. How's yours?
It's excellent. You know, Teresa, I just read an article about coffee last night. It was in that journal that Professor Clark recommended to us.
Which one was that? Oh, I think I know. Food Economics Review. Isn't that it?
That's the one. Anyway, in the article there were all kinds of interesting things about coffee that I'd never known before.
Yeah? Like what?
Well, did you know that over 30 million people earn their living from some aspect of coffee farming?
That's a lot of people. Coffee obviously has a lot of importance economically.
Absolutely. In fact, it's the second most valuable commodity in the world after oil.
Wow, well, if it's that big, it's probably produced and controlled by a few large companies, just like with oil.
Well, this article said otherwise. It said that most coffee is grown by farmers with only 4 or 5 hectares of land, and coffee's usually all they produce.
So who produces the most coffee? I mean, which country?
It depends on what type of coffee bean you're talking about.
Of course. Each country's coffee has a different flavour. My favourite's Jamaican.
What you're talking about isn't type. It's just regional variation. What I'm talking about is the coffee bean itself. One common type of coffee bean is called Robusta. It's grown at altitudes of below 600 metres.
Is that what we're drinking now?
Probably not. The coffee we're drinking is premium quality. Robusta is usually used to make instant coffee.
Yuck.
Anyway, the premium coffee, like the stuff we're drinking now, is from a type of bean called Arabica. They grow it higher up, at between 600 and 2,000 metres.
So those are the 2 types of coffee, are they?
Actually, there's one more, called Liberica. It's grown below 1,200 metres, but apparently it's not produced in very large quantities. It's used in blended coffees.
Listen, Bob, I'm still waiting for an answer to my question. Who grows the most coffee?
Now that I've explained the types, Teresa, I can tell you. For the Arabica type, it's Brazil, followed by Colombia.
So Latin America's the biggest producer?
Only for Arabica coffee. But it's also grown in large quantities in Africa too. In fact, the number 3 Arabica producer is Kenya.
What about the other type, Robusta?
The biggest producer of Robusta is Uganda, but the second largest is in Asia. That's Indonesia. In fact, Indonesia is the 4th largest producer of coffee in general in the world.
So tell me, Bob, did the article talk about how people like their coffee?
Yes, it did. In terms of preferred styles of coffee in different countries. The article divided these styles into instant coffee, espresso coffee and brewed coffee. It seems European countries tend to drink more brewed coffee. Countries like Sweden and Norway, for example. It's the same for the Germans. But strangely enough, in the UK, instant coffee is king. Perhaps they like the convenience of instant.
What about the Italians? I suppose espresso would be what they prefer.
That's right. And while espresso is popular across the border in France too, it's still outsold by brewed. In the US, people drink more cups of instant than anything else. But interestingly enough, in Japan, brewed coffee is the number one.
What about the producing countries?
Well, you're never going to believe this, Teresa, but Brazilians, for example, who grow all those beautiful premium beans, actually prefer instant. It's even more expensive than brewed.
Is there any sort of large world body that watches over all the buying and selling of coffee, like they've got for oil?
There is. It's called the International Coffee Organization, the ICO. It was actually set up by the United Nations in 1963 to try to stabilise the world coffee market. There's something like over 100 countries that belong to it, both producing countries and consuming countries.
So how does it work?
It's pretty complex from what I could gather from the article, but basically the ICO reckons that by controlling the amount of coffee that's available on the world market, they can keep prices from going too low or too high.
That sounds reasonable. Does it work?
Usually, but sometimes it doesn't. Back in 1975, Brazil produced almost no coffee at all because the coffee plants were killed before harvest by freezing weather.
Which meant that there was a demand but not much supply.
Exactly. Especially with Brazil being such a large producer. Anyway, as you'd expect, prices shot through the roof. The ICO couldn't do anything to help.
So people paid a premium for coffee then?
Well, no, actually. The prices went so high for half a year or so that millions of people no longer bought coffee. They couldn't afford to. So you know what happened next?
What? No, let me guess. If nobody's buying coffee, the price had to come down. Am I right?
Exactly right. The whole market collapsed, as a matter of fact, and coffee became cheaper than it had been for the previous 25 years. Unbelievable, but true.
Shall we order another cup?
That is the end of section 3. You now have half a minute to check your answers. Listening section 4. In a moment, you are going to hear a talk given by Catherine Blakely, who is a lecturer in management studies. She will be discussing aspects of business meetings. Before you listen, look at questions 34 to 41. Note the example that has been done for you. As you listen to the talk, answer questions 34 to 41.
Hello everyone, my name's Catherine Blakely. I'm Associate Professor of Management Studies here on campus. Today is the second in our series of talks on aspects of holding business meetings. Last week we talked about the most effective ways of leading meetings and the advantages and disadvantages of different leadership styles. Today, in this second talk of the series, I'd like to discuss the role of the facilitator in a meeting. For those of you who aren't aware, businesses and organisations in the past 20 years or so have turned to this idea of a facilitator. A facilitator is a person in the organisation who's chosen to ensure that meetings are carried out efficiently. The facilitator works together with a meeting leader, but their roles are quite different. The meeting leader concerns himself or herself with the content of the meeting. By content, I mean, of course, what the meeting's for. The facilitator, on the other hand, is more concerned with the process of the meeting. This notion of process includes the rules for the meeting and making sure everyone has a chance to participate. Okay, I next want to outline what are commonly known as the 5 global responsibilities of a facilitator. This is to give you a better idea of just what a facilitator does and why they're so important to meetings. One global responsibility is labelled blueprinting. Blueprinting a meeting involves creating an agenda and clarifying rules for the meeting. Much of this work is done together with a meeting leader. Blueprinting also means learning about each of the participants and what their goals and interests are with regard to the topic of the meeting. It also involves printing and photocopying documents for the meeting and assembling equipment such as visual aids. A second global responsibility is what we call pro-integration. Pro-integration happens during the actual meeting. For this, the facilitator must listen carefully to what the participants are saying, then clarify any unfamiliar terms or phrases spoken by the participants. He or she then summarizes what was said to ensure everybody at the meeting both fully understands and is fully understood. Global responsibility number 3 is what I term focusing. This is basically seeing that everyone keeps to the task at hand, not wandering off onto other topics. It's all too easy for discussion in a meeting to get off track. Here, the facilitator supervises the discussion, making sure all comments are relevant to the task. Focusing also involves knowing in which direction the meeting should be going and making sure it goes there. We can compare the facilitator's role here to that of a bus driver steering the group where they need to go. This brings us to prompting, which is our 4th global responsibility. Not everyone at a meeting may feel confident enough to talk, and we must remember that just because they're quiet, it doesn't mean that they've got nothing to contribute. So a facilitator might prompt people. That is, ask people questions or use other activities to get members involved. The task of prompting also means making sure that participants who tend to dominate allow the quieter members a chance to speak. After all, there's nothing more boring than having 1 or 2 people dominate a meeting. When participants get into disputes or arguments with each other, then it's time for the facilitator to take on the role of friction manager. This is the 5th global responsibility of the facilitator and the last on our list. Friction management means handling conflicts in a positive and constructive manner. During meetings, when members may have very different points of view, emotions can run high and people may begin to act negatively toward one another, getting into arguments or what have you. A good facilitator knows that this kind of negative behaviour serves no purpose at business meetings. Its effects are not constructive. So he or she then has to use his or her skills to return the group to a peaceful atmosphere and maintain that atmosphere. There are various skills involved in friction management, which I won't go into here, but basically, the notion of getting the group to focus on what they agree on rather than what they disagree on is vital.
That is the end of section 4. You now have half a minute to check your answers.